Now, a less severe example, but you've seen it in the news recently where there's been some moderate Muslims, moderate Mormons that have opened up the conversation about welcoming gays into the Mormon church. Well, one of those persons was excommunicated. And I don't know about the second one, I haven't heard. So sometimes our beliefs can get stretched, and those things that bind us can sometimes blind us, perhaps, to how we might go forward. Again, broad brushstrokes. Jonathan Haidt goes on to share some things about moral foundation that I think is very interesting. It's complicated, but I want to talk about this. Haidt would argue that we have 5 basic moral foundations in our country. And he ties those to politics, but I think you could also tie it to religion. One of those moral foundations is care. Care is looking out for the well-being of others. And it might cover everything from the poor to the elderly. Now, according to Haidt, the left and the right in this country, the polarized left and the right, look at care sometimes diametrically different. Let me give you an example. Again, broad brushstrokes. Don't be offended. The right might be more inclined to care for wounded warriors. And the left might be more inclined to care for spotted owls. Make sense? I'm not, again, broad brushstrokes, but stay with me. A second theory for a moral foundation is fairness, making sure that everyone is treated equally. The right in this country, especially the Tea Party, might say something like this: Democrats are socialists, taking money from hardworking Americans and trying to redistribute it. And if they're really on a roll, they might say redistributing it to lazy people that don't deserve it. On the other side of fairness, you might find the left saying something like this: fairness often implies equal opportunity, equal access to voting booths, minimum wage, and those kind of things. Not that one is right and one is wrong, they're just different, and that's Haidt's point. He goes on to a third category for moral foundation: loyalty, and that's the ties of the group to which you belong. On the right, we often see patriotism, God and country. On the left, we might see things like not so much leaning towards nationalism, but universalism, things that are broader, tying us to the world and the whole world. A fourth category: authority, respect for hierarchy, obedience to laws. Look no further than Ferguson for the different reactions in our country. On the right of this political spectrum, you often hear things about just obey the police. If the police ask you to stop, just stop. On the left, you might hear things like, make sure the police aren't unduly influenced by the color of your skin. And then finally, a fifth category for moral foundation: sanctity. Sacred boundaries, borders, traditions. On the right, you might hear a lot of talk about traditional marriage between a man and a woman. On the left, you might hear a lot of language about marriage equality, open to both gay and straight. According to Haidt, we have these moral foundations, and he would argue that people that from both the right and the left are concerned about care and fairness, those two moral foundations. But he would go on to say that the right puts a lot more emphasis on loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And that makes sense to me. It really made sense to me for some of the way we talk about values in this country. So what you end up with is, Haidt would argue that we have people on the left that are really concerned about care and fairness, and people on the right that are concerned about all of these things, but especially loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And a light went on for me, because it felt like, well, no wonder we're talking a different language sometimes and feel like we're from a different country sometimes, because we're emphasizing such different things. I don't know if you would agree with these things. We could pick these apart for a long, long time. But I found them interesting because we have these values, and why does it seem like one side is emphasizing something totally different on the other side, and can't we even speak the same language? And the answer, I think, sometimes is not very well. Not very well. Does that make sense? Does it at least strike some sort of chord with you as I share those things? I hope so. Let's go on to a third reason, I think, for polarization. And this is the culture wars, the rise of the culture wars. How many of you were alive in the 60s? How many of you were alive before the 60s? I'm sorry. I was too. And then the 60s came along, and what? What do you think of when you think of the 60s?
Free love.
Free love, okay. Well, I don't think of that, but thanks, Jim. What else do you think of? Well, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and then Jim over here with free love, okay? I know. So you get the 60s, and you get a lot of people, maybe the sanctity crowd, and the loyalty crowd, and the authority crowd, as there's these demonstrations that are going on, and our country seems to be falling apart, and people are spitting at troops when they come back from Vietnam, and it's a terrible time in our country. So you get people responding to this and saying, okay, what do we do? So I think one major aftershock, and this language comes from a book called American Grace, and it's by David Putnam and, I'm sorry, something Campbell. Putnam and Campbell. There you go. The last names at least. It'll come to me. So you get the 60s that happen, and then there's going to be a backlash. There's going to be an aftershock. And so at that time, you get the rise of religious conservatism in this country. Many deeply concerned about what they saw happening in the 60s. Sanctity, values, what are we going to do? Obedience, what are we going to do? And so evangelicals were really good about saying enough is enough. And they gathered together in churches. A lot of times these became mega churches. And they said premarital sex, no. Abortion, no. Homosexuality, no. Interracial marriage, no. And they drew the lines, and they were very good at drawing the lines very, very clearly. I don't think main lines were very good about drawing the lines. And so we began to see some exodus from some people that felt more comfortable with that clarity in evangelical, sometimes megachurches. And there's other factors too, demographic factors. Evangelicals tended to be having children at earlier ages, and they tended to have more children. And so you get this exploding sense that everybody's going over to the evangelical churches, and they're on the right side of what God intends for the church and God's people. And on the other side, you get the mainstream churches, the mainline churches, and they're kind of reeling because there's somewhat of an exodus from those mainline churches. In 1973, evangelicals and nuns, okay, you know what I mean by nuns?
Yeah.
Those people that would be not affiliated today, they accounted for about 30% of the population. Okay, so we're going to put evangelicals in the middle, or up here, and the nuns that are kind of not really affiliated. Maybe they're spiritual but not religious. Maybe they just don't care about religion at all. There was a lot of evangelicals, a growing number of evangelicals, but these two accounted for 30% of the population. And 20, 30 years later, they're accounting for 45 and 50% of the population. So what you get, why that's significant is, well, suddenly you've got more polarization built into the demographic chart. You got a whole lot of people that aren't talking to each other because suddenly those lines are more like this. And that's where we try to find ourselves, but this is where we struggle sometimes to find common language and the ability to even talk to each other as Christians. And so, yes, Bob?
Another thing, though, is that when the press talks about Christians, they think only about the top group. We all know this.
Say it again, who talks about them?
When the media interviews Christians, They only talk to the top group, not 90% of the time.
Evangelicals get a lot of attention. Rick Warren gets a lot of attention.
And the people in the middle, between those lines, get very little attention, so, you know, kind of the forgotten middle. That was what was happening in the 60s. And,
Yeah.
you know, it's the same sort of thing happening.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think if you look at the way we're characterized today as religion in this country, a lot of people will jump right to the evangelicals and the megachurches, the ones that have the money and the resources and tend to get the attention. I think that's true. Yeah, Mike?
You know, I'm not, that's one way to interpret it, but the other way to look at it is that those people are willing to give you a yes/no answer. Now, you might not agree
Yeah,
with
that's
their
true.
answer.
How much time do you have, Mr. News Guy? I need about 45 minutes to answer that question. That's a good point. It's a great point.
Yep.
Yeah. We don't always do nuance all that well in our country, do we? Yeah. Good point. Coupled with this aftershock, you get some religious types, kind of a merging of forces between religion and the evangelical movement and politics and moral thinking, and you get something like the moral majority in the 70s and 80s, and you get the rise of something called the religious right. And you get a whole bunch of folks like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson that are organizing and saying, it's time we put godly people into office. It's time we took back our country. It's time we organized it a certain way. And so what you end up with is a whole lot of people that aren't talking to each other in the same way anymore. And there's an incredible culture war that's beginning to emerge. And I look back at some of the statistics and I'm amazed. There used to be Republicans that would be openly pro-choice. And there used to be Democrats that were openly pro-life. I don't know if anybody talks that way anymore. I'm not suggesting one way or the other. I'm just saying that we drew lines, and they began in a lot of those times when we were putting religion and politics together and ending up with something called the religious right, and we were fighting like crazy to be in power and have our way win the day. Now, it's interesting, we don't have the time to talk about it very much, but there's been a second aftershock in the 90s and the 2000s where there has been this incredible youth disaffection with religion. I mean, if you talk to youth today, and the studies are overwhelming, they look at the church today, and I think you're right, Bob, they're looking at evangelical churches. They look at the church today, and this is their view of religion. It's judgmental, it's homophobic, it's hypocritical, and it's rigid. And they want nothing to do with it. So young people have been leaving the church in droves for about 20 years. And they're not just leaving the evangelical church, but they are leaving the evangelical church. They're leaving mainlines too. They lump us all in the same category and say, I don't want to be part of that church. I don't want to be part of that fight. I don't want to be part of that culture war. I'm gone. And so we see that at every turn, and it's incredibly painful and hard to deal with. Okay? So are you with me? I don't know if I'm right. I just see three things that have happened. The battle over the Bible, that sense of tribalism and religion and politics, the thing that is binding us also blinds us sometimes. And then finally, the rise of culture war. And there are certainly many things that perhaps connect to each other in these areas, but I think all of them seem to be forces, and they have led to a polarization in our country that is real and ongoing. Okay? So far, so good? I'm not saying this is a great picture, but so far, so good? Anybody want to throw in a comment? I know you're not upset. You got to go work on the choir, but that's good. We'll see. Any other thoughts on this before I go on? Yes.
Or in somewhat of a perverse way, I'll just throw in the thought, the idea that some of this division is because life is good, and we have the freedom and flexibility and the opportunity to think our own way and do our own thing, and less of a requirement to have to work together on the basics of life.
Okay. Yeah, okay. It's not like we have survival at issue. It's not like we're in the middle of a major world war. We got a bunch of soldiers that maybe are fighting 3/4 of the way around the world, and so really we're not even concerned as concerned sometimes as we might be about that. Yeah, that's a good point. Erland says that You know, when you have this time and the ability and communication that's all around us, well, some of this stuff is going to be natural because we have time to focus. Maybe it's a bad analogy, but I remember living in Kansas, and there were a bunch of railroaders in that town in Kansas, and a lot of them did not work in Kansas, they worked in Dalhart, Texas. And that's where they spent almost all their time. Well, guess what happened? All those people came home eventually and retired. And you know what? It was really hard to be retired together. It was. They kind of had to get almost remarried and figure out what relationship was going to look like. Sometimes when you got too much time, it's hard. It's hard to find a way forward. So that's a good point. Yep.
About Europe, if you take a look at that, that seems to have evolved more to the left,
Yes. Okay.
and it seems to be less religious also.
Yeah.
Is there a connection there?
I don't know. Good question. Yeah, maybe. All I can do is really focus on the United States. Really, I don't know as much about what exactly has happened to Europe along the way. It's a good question, but I can't really answer it.
There seems to be in this country too an emphasis more on individualism, and less on community working for the common good.
Yeah. Okay.
And whereas I think maybe even in Europe, you have French, German, Norwegians, whatever. There's a little bit more tribal or community.
It's an interesting point. Yeah, it certainly changes the dynamic
Yeah.
of what that looks like. Good point. Okay, I want to go to three very, very modest proposals for what we might do about those things that divide us. Okay? And they're not profound, but maybe they might help in some small little way. One of them is to practice humility in our lives. You know, I think humility is in short supply in our culture today. Turn on the TV, interrupting, yelling, shouting, screaming at each other. How could you possibly think that way? And I think humility is in very short supply in our world today. And it doesn't help us. It doesn't help us build any bridges along the way. I think it starts with a certain theological worldview. Certainly we can understand the need to listen respectfully to each other and to be engaged in thoughtful dialogue, but maybe even beyond or earlier than that, we need to approach God with a sense of humility, an awareness of how small we are and how big God is. You know, tribalism might be something that we can relate to, but maybe at times, even as a part of a tribe, you say, perhaps we don't know everything about this God we worship. Perhaps we don't know everything about what this God intends for us as we worship. That's a more humble way to approach this God. You think about 1 Corinthians 13, now we see in a mirror dimly. And maybe we need to say that to ourselves over and over again as we approach and seek for humility in our lives. Second commandment, what is it? It's not a trick question. What's the second commandment? People are lowering their head. They think I'm going to call on them directly. Thou shalt not, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. What's that about? We think it's about swearing, but it's really not about swearing. I like the way the NRSV translates that section from the Bible. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. You shall not make wrongful use. Now, not praying, I think, is probably, God wants us to pray. God wants us to lift up his name. But even more than that, as a pastor, if I stand up and say, this is exactly the way God thinks, and you get in line or else, how far am I going to take that? How far am I going to take that before it becomes something that feels like wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God? Not picking on conservatives alone here, but I think about some folks like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell that drew those lines pretty sharply, didn't they? They certainly drew it sharply over HIV. And they would say, and they still say, that HIV is God's judgment poured out upon gay people because of the choices they have made. Now, even as they're saying that, they don't realize that the vast majority of people that are HIV positive are heterosexual. And a lot of them happen to live in Africa. But I think we have to be careful, is my point, to when we speak for God to make too sweeping a judgments upon the rest of the world that's around us. It doesn't make for good press, of course. Maybe they don't want to come around and hear that kind of nuance, but I think that's part of our struggle as the people of God, trying to figure out what we can say and maybe don't and shouldn't say about this God of ours. Okay, one idea, practice humility. A second idea, do a better job of keeping the main things the main things. Who said that first? Keep the main things the main things. Stephen Covey, wasn't it? I don't know if he coined that, but Stephen Covey in his book 7 Habits, if I remember right, said keep the main things the main things. And that's hard. In a world with information coming at us from every side all the time. So what are those main things? What are those main things for you? We could have an interesting conversation about that as we talk about main things. What are the main things that we have in our church? There's a word, some of you know this word, others, it might be a brand new word, but it's certainly been around in Lutheran circles for a long time. Adiaphora. Anybody heard that word? Sure you have. What does it mean?
All the things on the outside.
All the things kind of on the outside. Things that are kind of beside the point, okay? We're just going to define it that way. Things that are beside the point. Give me some examples of things in a church or anywhere that are kind of beside the point.
Individual communion.
Individual communion, okay? Let's start with an easy one. The color of the carpeting. The color of the carpeting. My dad served a church in South Dakota. He followed a pastor, the same pastor twice, and both times that pastor had split the church. And both times it was over a building project. And it was hard. I was profoundly influenced by that as a kid. And my dad had a list of all the people that had left the church over this building project in South Dakota. And you know why they split? They were going to build a parish ed unit. Some people wanted to build that education unit on the east side, and some people wanted to build it on the west side. Now, it's never just about that, is it? Never just about that. It's about control. It's about who gets to decide. It's about power. And they split the church, and it's something like 145 families left over that issue. Over that issue. And adiaphora. It's all adiaphora. But you can't tell that to those people that left. I remember my dad, he had a list. I'm sure I shouldn't have seen it as a kid, but I did. And he kept track of where all those people were. And he would go and visit with them and ask them to come back. And I think one day I forget the exact number, but I think it was all but 2 or 3 of those families eventually came back. So, good for my dad for trying to keep the main thing the main thing. The length of a worship service, not a main thing. The age at which we commune, not a main thing. The amount of water we use in baptism, not a main thing. It really isn't.
But the length of the sermon is a main thing.
The length of the sermon is the main thing. Okay. Thank you, Jim. I think that's good, right? Martin Luther, at the heart of the Reformation, we are saved by grace through faith. That's not a bad place to start when we're thinking about main things. I'm not saying they weren't thinking about other things, but boy, the Reformation spiraled out of control as they thought about how Jesus was present in communion and baptism and everything else under the sun. It's hard to keep the main things the main thing, but terribly important, I think, if we're going to find ways beyond our differences. And then finally, a third and last thing, past our differences or through our differences, building bridges of understanding and peace. Right? The book Amazing Grace. Here, I got the authors' names written down. David Campbell and Robert Putnam. David Campbell and Robert Putnam. It's a sociological book. It's 550 pages. I'm not recommending it, but interesting. They have studies that show that 93% of Americans believe that America is divided along racial lines. I don't know what you think about that after Ferguson, but it'd be an interesting conversation. they did additional studies. Another question. 96% see divisions along economic lines. Interesting conversation. There's a lot of truth to some of that. 97% say the country is divided along political lines. So this was the hopeful statistic they found, okay? The hopeful one. Only 70% say the country is divided along religious lines. Only 72%. And they thought that was great. So they followed that question up, and they talked about that. What does that mean? I mean, we have different religions and religious differences in this country. Certainly, sometimes we struggle when there's Christian churches that are next to Buddhist temples and Muslim houses of prayer, and we wonder how to get along. Sometimes we're not that far from the days when parents were telling me, whatever you do, don't marry a Catholic. We're not that far away. But according to Robert Putnam, and David Campbell, as they studied people further about those religious differences, they found some great signs of hope. And they saw religion in this country as the real civic glue, a sort of civic glue that ties us together. And it tends to unite rather than divide. Now, Americans typically have friends and family of different faiths. And sometimes that faith is within the Christian church, and sometimes that faith is beyond the Christian church. And we have our own network then of religiously diverse social and religious engagements that impact who we are. And so one of the questions that Putnam and Campbell asked was, so who's going to heaven? Who's going to be in heaven? And it's a great question. It'd be a great question for us to talk about here. And what they found is that there was a widespread belief that there are many paths to heaven. Now, the one group of people that didn't like this question very much were the clergy. The clergy didn't like this question. They couldn't answer it yes and no in simple little format. They had to have a book or two or three and struggle mightily with the answer to that question. But what they found is a lot of people in the pew understanding that there were many paths to heaven. Again, I'm going to be a little careful. These are broad brush strokes. But 98% of Mormons believe that a good person not of their own faith could go to heaven. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? 96% of mainline Protestants believe this. A good person not of their own faith can go to heaven. 93% of Catholics believe this. 86% of the Missouri Synod believed this. I was surprised by that. And 83% of evangelicals believe this. Now, the question becomes different when you say, we're talking specifically about people that are non-Christian. Then the question becomes different. The percentages becomes different. A lot of them get lower. But there's still a lot of openness about that. I shouldn't share this story, but I will. The Missouri Synod was the most interesting part of this conversation. They got together with some pastors, and they were talking about this information, and the Missouri Synod pastors, and there was a number of them, basically said, well, those people are just wrong. They're wrong. And then Putnam and Campbell came back and said, well, what if people in your pews feel differently than you do? And so almost to a person, the Missouri Synod pastors all said they're wrong. And so then they came back, they did the research, they came back and said 86% of your people think that there are many paths to heaven, and good persons of another faith can go to heaven. And they shared that information. 86%, and the Missouri Synod pastors hung their heads and said, we have failed. We have failed. It's a struggle to figure out who's part of this, the people of God, and who's going to heaven, and how we're going to talk to each other, and on what kind of terms. And we can all draw our lines, and sometimes I think we pastors are the worst in this process of anybody. I'll admit it, and I'm sorry for that. But we all struggle as the people of God, I think, to find ways to be able to talk to each other. And so, in the midst of of a country where we struggle over the Bible, and we struggle over our tribalism, and we struggle over our culture wars, I think it's easy enough to find Jesus saying things like, well, let's show some and practice some humility in our lives. Let's come along and let's keep the main things the main thing. And let's come along and let's build some bridges of understanding and peace. We might not change the whole world, but we might change our little corner of it. And it might be better and richer and more Christ-like, I'd like to think, because of it. Thanks for coming today.